Okay, everybody, we've gotten the go. Hello to everyone online and in the room, lots of old friends and some new friends. It's great to see you all. My name is Marcy Harris and I am Executive Director of PopBox Foundation. Very happy to be co-hosting with our friends from the Niskanen Center and to be here on the Hill with all of you. You may know that we at PopBox Foundation are a little obsessed with Congress. I'm a former staffer, my colleagues are former staffers, both sides of the aisle. We love this place and we work every day to support you, the staff, and this institution to help it modernize and better serve the American people. I'm really honored today to be here with one of my dearest friends, Jen Pahlka, whose work has had a profound impact on how we think about government and how we think about making it work in practice. And I'm also so glad to finally meet in person Andrew Greenway and to learn from his experience in the UK. I always think it's super helpful to get examples from abroad to hear that the challenges that we're facing are not quite so unique, and also that there's a lot we can learn from each other. So as you all know from your own work, getting a bill signed into law is only half the battle. The real challenge is making sure that the law does what your boss intended it to do. And that's where this conversation begins. So in recent weeks, we've seen a flurry of activity in the executive branch, lots of strong reactions across the political spectrum. But regardless of how you feel about the specifics, the effort reflects a core truth that there's growing recognition that the way our government operates, the how, is as important as the policy itself. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Jen and Andrew are here to share lessons from the front lines of policy implementation, what works, what breaks down, and what Congress can do differently to help close the gap between legislative intent and real-world results. Their new paper, and I have a prop. The How We Need Now, a Capacity Agenda for 2025 and Beyond, makes the case that we need to rebuild state capacity, start with the basics, and create real feedback loops between policy and execution. So with this event, we're kicking off a new series designed to help staffers go beyond traditional legislative training, anticipate implementation issues, before they become casework problems, which for the caseworkers out there, we're very happy to have you with us, avoid common policy design pitfalls, and ultimately craft legislation that delivers better results for your boss and their constituents. So we're keeping the format simple. We will talk to Andrew and Jen and get their lessons learned, and if what they share resonates, I strongly recommend that you go pick up the report, read it for yourself, and ask them some questions. So, Jen, I know a lot of people here are familiar with your work. Many have read your book, Recoding America. They may even be subscribers to your spicy Substack, which is called Eating Policy. You can explain where the name comes from. But for those who aren't super familiar, can you please share a little bit about your own experience coming into government without a public policy background and what it means to land in the executive branch on the implementation side and what you thought about Congress then?
Are you asking me to tell tales?
I still just think it is something that we have to note that I worked on the team that did the Affordable Care Act, and then you came in to fix the breakdown posthealthcare.gov as they were implementing the Affordable Care Act. So we've shared some war stories over the years.
Yes, we have. I really did not have the role in fixing healthcare.gov that people subscribe to, but it has been a lovely thing over the years to be able to see the world from sort of this side of the mirror and then your side of the mirror. And I've learned so much from that. And I thank you for
Likewise.
that. And thank you for putting this event on today with the Niskanen team, everyone who set it up. Thank you so much. Yeah, I came from the tech industry into government. When I came to the White House in 2013, I was part of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I was the Deputy Chief Technology Officer. and I was there to stand up what became the United States Digital Service, which really only happened in part, well, I think it really would not have happened had we not had the failure of healthcare.gov. And I say failure in heavy air quotes because it succeeded in the long run, but it was a very rocky first couple of months. For those of you who were not around for that, you probably at least saw the headlines. And I had come from working in state and local government, so I kind of figured, oh, I know what this is going to be like. But what I found really was a lot of, wait, this can't be how this works. So many incredibly creative and dedicated people, but sort of chasing down really what in the end were kind of the wrong things to chase down. And so much miscommunication, so much of that, I'm just speaking to healthcare.gov, for example, being really set up to fail in so many ways. And not because the people who wrote the ACA or had a hand in the ACA wanted it to, and not because they were trying to make life difficult for the executive branch agencies that had to implement this, particularly such as Medicare and Medicaid services. And not even because of necessarily what was in the ACA. I mean, some of it was that, right? But because policy accumulates and accretes over time in all sorts of areas. So you had the existing incredibly restrictive and constraining rules around procurement, right? You had all sorts of compliance frameworks that one had to deal with, which made this like a really, really, really hard task. And I talk in the book a lot, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, about the projects that happened after the ACA and the ways in which that team was dedicated to not making those mistakes again. And a lot of what they had to do wasn't just like, okay, we're dealing with these difficult, procurement constraints, we're dealing with staffing constraints, we have all these mandates and constraints that have, landed down from legislative bodies mostly over time. But also to say, we have to go back upstream. We have to actually have a channel of communication to understand what we're being asked to do. And we can't just do literally what we've been told to do in a way that will get the opposite outcome of what the people who wrote the law intended. And that really has set me off on this journey of, look, it matters, of course, what you're trying to achieve. You really have to think about the how when you're doing this, or you're gonna have problems like the ACA, or you're gonna have successes like MACRA. And we'll talk a little bit about why MACRA succeeded.
And hearing words like constraints and outcomes, I just want to asterisk those. But the other word that we're hearing a lot is how. And I think it's fair to say we now have the international expert on the how with us, Andrew Greenway. Co-wrote The How We Need Now with Jen, but also was one of the co-authors on The Radical How in the UK, which was an incredible document that came out also in 2024 that I sent around to everybody I knew saying, we need one of these in the US.
But I'm saying the same thing.
But can you explain how you became the how expert and a little bit of your background?
My natural British modesty is making this very uncomfortable. The international how I can't fully own that. Really good to meet you all. So my background, just to give you a sense of where this has come from. So I'm a recovering public servant myself. I worked in the UK government executive branch in various roles for quite a long time. And I sort of joined as a sort of fairly archetypal sort of generalist public servant, if you like. I did a bit of policy, did a bit of strategy. And then I sort of found myself essentially being radicalized by helping to set up a new team based in the sort of centre of government called the Government Digital Service. And the Government Digital Service was there to do a bunch of different things. It was there to digitise a whole bunch of public services. It was there to drive government efficiency, but it was really kind of in a sort of slightly clandestine way about institutional reform. And that kind of brought me into contact with different ways of working and kind of different ways of delivering policy intent from end to end.
And it was also in the business of inspiring other units like it, like USDS.
So I mean, it's a fairly controversial statement, but in a sort of slightly warped way, the government digital service in the UK is in sort of the long distant British grandfather of Doge, if you kind of draw the full line across time. And that kind of was, as I say, quite transformative experience for me in my career, in the sense that it kind of turned me from somebody who was, I suppose, kind of inclined to operate at that kind of relatively rarefied world of policy and legislation, and brought me into contact with people who built things and designed things, and also kind of did so by drawing on user research and the kind of the techniques that the sort of internet era organizations would use, and applying them into government. And off the back of that, I left the civil service around about 2016, 2017. And I set up a consultancy called Public Digital, who now works with governments all over the world on institutional reform. And what's been really interesting about that, and working in places as diverse as Madagascar, through to Canada, through to Japan, is everybody thinks they're special. Every country in the world and every government in the world thinks they're special, and they are, right? There are some uniquely contextual wrinkles and creases and cultural issues that are different, but there's an enormous amount of commonality, actually, and some of the kind of the fundamental topics that we touched on in our report around the how of doing this are sort of universal, regardless of separation of powers and institutional shapes and the kind of the cultures of those bureaucracies. There's an incredible commonality, I guess, in some of these issues around the world.
Okay, let's jump in. So the two of you say that policy accretion over time, layers and layers of requirements and hurdles and other really well-intentioned things that are put in for really good reasons at certain points in time along the way can build up and cause problems. What do you mean? What are some examples of that?
Well, forgive me for using an example at the state level, but I think a lot of people really felt this very viscerally, which was the crisis in unemployment insurance during the pandemic. And actually, that was one of the times I spent, not in person, because we're all virtual then, but a lot of time actually with the California State Legislature and the people in their offices who were taking the literally thousands of calls a day from constituents saying, I applied for unemployment insurance in March. It's now July. I am on my last packet of ramen. What do you want me to do? And actually, I mean, I had so much empathy for the people who were calling. I also had just enormous empathy for these staffers who were quitting, in droves because they couldn't sleep at night. They just couldn't keep taking these phone calls from folks, and who were really in a very tough spot, because California in particular had what turned out to be a backlog of 1.3 million unpaid unemployment insurance claims. So at this time, I was asked by the governor to co-chair a strike team to clear this backlog. And I also ended up with a whole bunch of empathy for the people running the EBT, who I have criticisms of as well. If you read the first 3 chapters of my book, I think you'll get that. It's a pretty balanced look. But it's very hard to deliver that benefit to people. And the best example, I think, or the best illustration of it that I saw was, every state's labor agency commissioner got called up in front of their state legislature and screamed at, saying, why can't you get these, how hard is it to get somebody a check or a bank card? Rob Asaro-Angeles, the labor commissioner for the state of New Jersey, he went to the hearing and brought boxes and boxes of paper and put them on the table. They were labeled 7,119 pages of active UI regs. And that's not all from, that some of this is Congress talking to DOL, so it's like, UPLs from DOL, some of it's the state. UI varies widely among states, and each state legislature has, passed a whole lot of, quite a few bills sort of governing their use of unemployment insurance. But imagine trying to do something as simple as, look, you're laid off. We're going to give you some portion of your salary under some conditions for some number of weeks. That's essentially unemployment insurance. But in that state alone, and just the active reg, 7,119 pages, it's really hard to do that. And I developed a relationship with one particular, back to California, one particular state legislator, and who was just fantastic. He was just on it. He was really like following all of everything that was coming out of EDD, that's the Economic Development Department, and analyzing it just so brilliantly, like exactly what you want in a legislator, like really engaging in it on behalf of his constituents, trying to fix the problem. But he was also, you know, passing legislation at the same time. And one of the bills that he put through was to make he wanted the application process to be available in more languages, which is a great thing. And in like normal times, it would have been, yes, absolutely, we want to do that. But I told him, please don't do that right now. Like this agency needs to clear 1.3 million claims backlog. And if you add another mandate right now to them, oh, by the way, also a whole bunch of other constraints, they're not going to be able to do the job that we most need them to do. And he was like, silly, silly, silly. And I remember a year later, he came back to me and was like, Jen, I'm so sorry. You were absolutely right. That was not the right time to be adding more mandates and constraints to an agency that couldn't deliver on its own. So it's not that we didn't need to do things and the legislature shouldn't be acting. It's that it was a time to use restraint and focus on the capability building and enablement of that agency to do the basic thing that it was supposed to do. But you know, bringing it back to the federal government, in terms of volume of regulations that govern, the DoD will tell you it's 100 copies of War and Peace, right? That govern. Is that right, Ben? Something like that, yeah. That it takes up to a year to figure out if they are authorized to do a given thing, right? These are time cycles that are just not relevant in the modern era. They're not relevant to meeting the needs, whatever, if that's getting an employment insurance check or, you know, deterring an adversary. And they can't necessarily reduce that on their own. They need air cover to work with a simpler set of rules.
So I can almost guarantee that the drafters of the UI legislation did not intend for New Jersey to have regulations that range to 17,000 pages. I know that no one writing policy in this room thinks to themselves, I'm going to set a requirement in statute that then leads to that. So
And nobody wrote thousands of pages. Everybody wrote 5 pages, but everybody wrote them. Yes.
yeah, but so I guess we're coming to feedback loops. I want to talk about feedback loops and how ledge branch folks talk to executive branch folks, or how executive branch folks, when they are in the weeds and seeing something that they can tell is not going to work, as they are developing regs or as they are talking to the people that are going to need to implement at the state or local level, what can we do to have them send up a flare and just kind of ask, hey, Congress, is this really what you intended? And if not, can we get some clarification on this or that language? Andrew, actually, I want to pop over to you first and just ask, because you're in a totally different situation where I'm sure things work perfectly. Because in the UK, you got a parliamentary system, so the lawmakers in the majority party are also the ministers in the agencies. So they go over there, they figure out what's wrong, and then they write a bill that perfectly addresses the situation, right?
Oh, yeah, that sort of. So the UK does have, I think, certain structural advantages because of that way the executive and the legislature are structured. And so we also have the advantage whereby we can draft secondary legislation. So a bill can be passed and then you can kind of fill in the legislative details later with kind of a lot less or a lot quicker parliamentary scrutiny to kind of fill in those blanks, which you think would therefore allow for, okay, if you're going about designing a complicated service, you could iterate the policy and legislative framework at the same time as the delivery of the service. And there's quite a good sort of story that illustrates when that works well and when that works badly within the same service. So back in around sort of 2011, the UK government, the biggest sort of social policy change we were making at the time was implementing something called universal credit. And universal credit was basically the biggest change to the welfare system that the UK had attempted in about 60 years. It was combining 6 working age benefits into one. And the government set up a program to kind of deliver that in a very traditional sense. Some smart people kind of turned the minister's intent into a long list of policy requirements. Those policy requirements were then turned into a long list of technical requirements. People who are going to build that system, people who were going to build that system were inevitably a bunch of consultants, so that was outsourced to them. They built some IT systems, and at that point, they handed it over to the frontline staff who went, well, this clearly isn't going to work, but fine, we'll try it. And then finally, after 3 years, that was the first time that that could actually hit the public. And at that point, our legislature, one of the committees, an oversight committee, took one look at that program and went, despite total political consensus that this is the right thing to do, so bipartisan agreement, the intent is right, we should be combining these benefits, this is a rational thing to do, the implementation is profoundly flawed, this is not going to work. And you're already at $500 million in the hole. How are you going to actually kind of unravel this? Because effectively at that stage, the policy and legislation amounted to 2 thick ring binders, so your kind of War and Peace versions, so around 1,400 pages, and all that was untested assumptions. Every line. That had never been tested in reality with real people. So what the program did at that point was go, okay, this is a crisis, this is basically the government's biggest policy, we have to fundamentally change this, otherwise we could lose the election, certainly ministers are going to lose their jobs. So in that crisis, they went, fine, we're going to embrace a fundamentally different way of doing this, whereby we test and learn with very, very tight feedback loops. So when they went back to the drawing board and went, okay, what are we actually trying to do here with this? It's not deliver universal credit, it's getting more people in more work, more of the time. That's our North Star. And we're going to build a new version of that service for 100 households in a single borough of London. And we're going to test it end to end, see what works, see how people react, see which bits of the legislation stand up, see which bits of semantics actually don't. What is the definition of a couple? Turns out people have quite different views on that. That's not so obvious on the page of legislation necessarily, but it becomes pretty clear when you put it in front of people who are using that service for real and relying on it for their kind of monthly benefits payments. Their interpretation of a couple turned out to be quite different from the Secretary of State's interpretation. It's those kind of wrinkles and nuances that you have to kind of put this thing in front of real people to get. It's extremely difficult to do that just with legislative drafting. And it's a very kind of humbling experience, I think, as a legislative drafter. You're smart people. You think, oh, we can probably anticipate most of these things and what people will think and how people can react. And putting the service in front of people and watching in a user research lab how they react to the thing that you think is perfectly built and then they can't use it. I mean, they tell you they can use it, but you can see them literally clicking the wrong button. There's no real substitute for that. And kind of coming back to how you bring this to life for elected officials and politicians, there's nothing more powerful than actually putting those people in the room and watching the public use that service, watching them fail at using that service, watching the kind of the frontline staff who are figuring out the back end of in the building, who are sort of literally wheeling around trolleys of paper, seeing that. So the casework letters, and I know you'll be kind of dealing with hundreds and thousands of these, they are incredibly powerful, I'm sure, and kind of really kind of have that emotional pull, but actually to kind of convince both elected officials and frankly our senior public servants of how powerful this loop was, putting them in the room and watching how it worked, or more to the point, didn't. There was no more effective way of changing people's minds than that.
That is very inspiring, and I'm trying to figure out how we can make that happen in the US system. So how we get legislators in the room watching an implementation challenge, but Jen, you've
Well,
got.
I think we have seen,
Okay.
I know when the team that worked on the FAFSA was bringing it sort of back from its rather rocky start last year.
We do have caseworkers online.
I don't know
so
if
just
anybody-
waving to them.
I don't know who it was, but I've been talking with the team that was brought in to help get the FAFSA going again. And they brought the beta version of the sort of revived revive FAFSA to the hill. So some of your colleagues came in and tried it. Now, they weren't looking at real users using it. They were trying to use it themselves. But I'll tell a quick positive story that is not legislation, but executive branch rulemaking and guidance. So I've been railing about the Paperwork Reduction Act for a really long time. You will probably hear me continue to rant about it, sorry. It's my favorite topic. But here's a really wonderful thing that happened with the Paper Reduction Act last year. So this is not everyone's favorite law, so I get it. Like, it is, it was written in 1980. It says basically if an executive branch agency wants to get information from more than 10 people, they have to go through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, get approval. There's twice it has to go post to the Federal Register, get feedback, blah, blah, blah. It's a big barrier to doing what Andrew was talking about, or it has been interpreted as a big barrier to that user research, like putting it in front of actual users. And some wonderful people in OIRA acknowledged that it was being interpreted by agencies to prevent user research, even though it was never meant to do that. And so they went to, actually, I think what happened is they heard me rant about this on the Ezra Klein show. When my book came out, I'm like, okay, we want to engage with this person who's going to talk about this nerdy topic in more public forums. And they said, okay, we want to write guidance that tells the agencies that they can actually, put something like a universal credit or a FAFSA in front of users to get feedback. I don't. We have to tell the agencies that. And they wrote a first version of this guidance. And with some help from folks at the USDS, they said, look, let's just, we know what you mean by those words. Can we take that over to some people in an agency and ask them what they hear when they read it? And the first pass was exactly the opposite of what they intended. And again, this isn't anyone's fault. It's not that the people over Iowa were trying to keep people from doing user research, and it's not that the people in the agencies were willfully misinterpreting what they wrote. It's just that people hear things differently. And so they did what you're going to hear us say a lot, which is multiple iterative rounds of testing and learning, where they put their users in this case were not end users trying to apply for universal credit or FAFSA or unemployment insurance. They were officials in agencies responsible for getting these services out the door. But you can do research with those people as well. And in fact, you should. And it took multiple rounds of getting like, well, when you write this, that's what this means for us in our agency. This is how we are forced to operationalize those words that you give us. And they're like, okay, back around, back around, back around. I think it was not till the end of December, right before the end of the administration, that they got this new guidance out the door. And the people in the agencies are now saying, yes, we understand this. We now know how to operationalize this in a way that is consistent with what you intended. But if they had shipped their first version, we would just be back in that cycle of me complaining to everybody that no one can do user research in agencies because we didn't test it with the people who were going to interpret it.
Okay, so you actually have a term for this cascade of rigidity that you guys describe in great detail in the report. So can you talk a little bit about this depressing circle of things getting worse and worse and worse and onward before they hit the kind of new approach that you just described?
Yeah, so the cascade of rigidity is a term I accidentally coined to talk about how that happens, right? And there's a long example in the book that's sort of become canonical about the Air Force believing that there is this requirement for them to use what's called an enterprise service bus in software. And in fact, many people until recently would tell you that it's required in all DoD software. And if you trace that back up, it's like, why do they believe this? Well, it comes from this architecture document, which derives from this other architecture document, which derives from the Clinger-Cohen Act, which derives from, this came from Congress in 1995 saying there needs to be a plan for all government IT and like in no way, shape or form did Congress mean to specify that an enterprise service bus, which is just a wonky kind of 90s technology that no one uses anymore, be in all of our federal IT. But as it was interpreted every layer down from Congress to the White House to the CIO Council to all of these documents, each time it became a little bit more rich. Like at one point it was used as an example of interoperability in a document. And then from there, it's just this like slide into a requirement. But there's this enormous, it's a game of telephone. There's an enormous disconnect from what's meant at the level of writing law and policy and how that is actually operationalized. And I saw that in action when I was researching the book, and I worked with this team on who had implemented MACRA, Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act of 2015, which you're all very familiar with. You know, wonderful laws that tell CMS to do things. But this is a law that was designed to pay doctors better for better quality care. And the way it was being operationalized was so subject to that cascade and so rigid that the team on the ground could see that it was going to drive doctors crazy, essentially, and they would opt out of Medicare, and that would reduce the quality of care available to folks. And they were doing things like reading in the law this mention that doctors could form virtual groups across state lines and interpreting that as a requirement to build a Facebook for doctors, which Congress never intended. But like when I interviewed this team, like so you're reading that you're being told by CMS General Counsel that you must build this entire software suite or this entire thing they're calling Facebook for doctors. You as a delivery team believe it is not required when you're looking at the law. What do you do? And like the enormous frustration about like, well, can't you just go back and ask? Hey, Congress, did you want us to build a Facebook for doctors? Like the answer on a practical basis really is no, they can't. And we've got to fix that. Because that would, if they had gone and built that, all of the resources that could have been, that needed to be put into building a fantastic interface for doctors to upload their quality data, to implement MACRA, would have gone into this thing that was like utterly useless and no one wanted it, right? Like literally nobody wanted to use it. We know that, like empirically. But that was one of like 5 different stories that I heard about this team being subject to, generally it was like the GC or the policy team telling them they had to do these things that were just bananas. And they were all had, let's get back to another theme of this thing, the best of intentions. They're not, in these cases, they were not trying to subvert congressional intent. What they were doing was being overly diligent about trying to do exactly what they thought Congress said to do. But again, it's a game of telephone. They can't go back and say, do you really want us to do this? Do you really want to make us force all doctors who are going to be exempt from it next year to go through it for the first year? Of course, that's a bananas thing to do. We don't want to do that. But they need a feedback loop to be able to check on these things and say, not only I want to know what you intended, but here is what we are learning as we start to implement this. We are learning that doctors will revolt, and we need to be able to give you that feedback so that we can make the adjustments and steer the ship towards the intent of the law instead of like fighting over like, did this mean Facebook for doctors? Like we need to be focused on the outcome and be able to make little adjustments along the way to get toward what Congress intended.
Just to sort of double down briefly on what Jen was saying about good intentions. I mean, that's such a universal theme, like this, you know, clearly in the US, but you look at the UK or Canada, like, you know, it's exactly the same. No one is intending for this to kind of turn out the way it does. And there are definitely kind of aspects of legislative behavior, I think, that can send usefully different signals that kind of counter some of this. So fundamentally, the thing to do is to close down that and sort of tighten that feedback loop as much as possible, as Jen said. But there are certain things that parliamentary committees have done in the UK that I think will be kind of quite important in terms of sending different signals on some of this. So, for example, our national auditor, so I guess the GAO here, I'm going to get my acronyms wrong, forgive me, but they came out, they do an annual speech to Parliament, and he gave it last month, and he specifically said, right, we're gonna ding civil servants for not experimenting, for not showing innovation, for not tightening those feedback loops. And sending, so that is, and quite often the reason that public servants will behave in that kind of relatively risk-averse interpretive way is because they're scared that the auditor will say, actually, you know what, that's not on. We'll kind of give you a kind of a blank mark for that. And it's the same with oversight committees as well. So one of the more effective parliamentary committees in the UK tend to be quite, I can't think of quite the right word. I'm going to use mature, but that's sort of slightly loaded. But they are more accepting of experiments that fail for the good reasons, i.e. they fail relatively quickly, they fail with relatively low cost, and the department or the officials responsible for that experiment are not kind of hauled over the coals because they have learned from that and then applied it anew. So, for example, there's a department in the UK, Department of Work and Pensions, that's done a bunch of experiments using AI. Like they've tried lots of different things to try and improve the speed and quality of policy advice, all sorts of random stuff. They've not spent a lot of money. Most of them have stopped. Great, good. Rather than kind of doubling down on those things and spending additional years and millions of dollars sort of backing dead horses. So there are signals, I think, that the sort of the legislative branch can send that help sort of temper some of that risk-averse instinct that you might get further into the system.
I will just confirm that that is not currently a part of our culture in oversight at the moment, but risk tolerance and encouraging experiments is something we could definitely aspire to at some point. But you have some recommendations and would love for you to cover in the report. You identify lots of problems, but you also have 4 recommendations for how we can start to address this. Tell us, please.
I mean, there's lots. I mean, I just to pick on one element here, because we've not talked about it as much. So we talk in the report about investing in digital infrastructure, and sort of you kind of might read that on a surface level, and you might go, okay, well, build loads of technology. Not quite. Like there's elements of that. Clearly, there'll be underpinning systems and common platforms that will allow you to kind of build services more quickly and less duplicatively. But actually, what we're talking about in that report is a couple of things. One is changing the model by which technology is funded. So the way technology is funded tends to be kind of, I mentioned universal credit earlier, that's a kind of classic story of this. You'll kind of come up with a list of requirements up front. Over a long period of time, a business case will be written. That might take a year to write. It will give billions of dollars out to the team doing it, and 10 years, and off you go, sort that out, build that thing. And government likes doing that and thinking of it in those terms because it's got a nice, solid end date. It's like, great, we'll spend some money, we'll apportion that, it's done, don't have to worry about it, they'll deliver these outputs in the end. Doesn't normally work like that though, does it? Because normally what happens is the thing doesn't get delivered and you have to go back to the well. But worse is that when those technology projects are conceived, they're conceived as you would a kind of building a bridge or building a nuclear submarine, things that can be predicted up front. And actually the complexity in those services is such that it's literally impossible to define the requirements of a service like that up front. No matter how smart you are, no matter how much time you try and plan up front to mitigate that risk, you're actually just storing up more and more risk with that false certainty. So it's far more powerful to have what we call product funding, whereby there's an enduring funding of the teams that kind of persists through time. And I mentioned teams because one of the things that's sort of quite interesting to watch from the outside with Doge doing what's doing the executive actions is there's a lot of clearing away space, which is good. But what's less clear to me is kind of how you build back the kind of the effective bits of the state. And I mentioned the team that I worked in when I was a public servant in the government digital service. We did a lot of clearing away stuff. Like we closed a lot of boards, we stopped a lot of programs. I think we saved about $5 billion in 4 years, which I know in American terms is like trivial, but it was quite a big deal for us. But we also
could use the $5 billion.
Oh yeah, no, it's not quite a small change. But the point was we were also building back kind of teams, multidisciplinary teams who are building things like, as I say, some of those new services, digitizing how you get applied for a passport, that sort of sensible thing, showing what the new version of state capacity could look like. And you know, one of the things, again, speaking as an outsider, like it was quite sad for me to see kind of what happened with USDS and 18F and some of those teams, because, you know, they embodied that kind of public purpose and building back and building strength within the state. And sort of as cousins of some of the work that I did in the UK, I was surprised to sort of see that go, because that felt like part of exemplifying what building a new kind of you know, strengthened public realm could look like. So investing in those teams, but making sure that those teams are folding together some of the policy and legislative aspects with those digital and technology ones, with the operational knowledge on the front line. I think that's where a lot of the power of this approach actually comes out.
Can I add a couple of things to that? The slight silver lining, I think, of the tragedies you described, which I feel as well, is that those capabilities really do belong in the agencies. And so we have like a fantastic team at VA, at CMS. State has really come a long way, and we really that's really the best place for them anyway. So hopefully there'll be more challenges there. Let's not get into this, but in the report, we talk about digital competence, both in centralized groups. We wrote the report sort of the end of the year last year before Joe started its work. And my concern at the time was actually funding for USDS. We wanted the centralized groups funded, but also they can't just be in the White House or a GSA. They have to be in the agencies as well. But I want to make sure we don't over-index here on sort of the tech side of it. We're really talking about general ability of government to achieve its policy goals. And tech is a fundamental part of that, but there are so many other aspects of it as well. And when Andrew talks about a product approach, part of that is, or a big part of that is the funding model. And again, there's a lot of progress that agencies have made to understand how to do this differently, to let go of the legacy ways of working and adopt the new ones. But when the funding is in a legacy model, it's very hard to do that. And there's some translation work that needs to happen and I think it's probably the hardest work, I would say, on this, like the spectrum for me of like, yeah, I know how to do that. And oh my gosh, I'm completely like, I don't know what to do. It's closer to that. We need to partner with organizations like PopBox and people like you to say, like, how do we bridge that distance between the way we fund things today and the way they need to be funded to be successful, right? So there's a lot in the report that I think sounds very confident, and I'm confident that these are things that we need to work on, but actually we have a long way to go to really specify what we mean there. And this is one of those things where it's like, really only you can do this. The agencies cannot do this for themselves very well. But maybe I can touch briefly also just a couple of other pillars. So the big buckets of recommendations in the report are, the framing is, if you want a government that can achieve its policy goals, it has to be able to do 4 things. Number 1, you have to be able to hire the right people and fire the wrong ones. I realize that that is like a rabbit hole we can get into given all the firing that's happening right now, but just pulling back for a second, prior to January 21st, we could not do that well in executive branch agencies. It takes a very long time to hire. We're very bad at using proper assessments, and it's very hard to hold somebody accountable to good performance. Whatever else is going on in the world, we need to fix that. If you're on the left and you care about rebuilding government back up, if that is an option for your party in the future, you're not going to be able to do it with our current hiring practices. It just takes far too long and too much energy. I will also say we have more, there's been a lot in the news about the number of people who've been fired at agencies. That is only the beginning. It's happening. Agencies are being asked, to come up with their plans for far larger reductions in force in the fall. If we do it using the current algorithm, by which I mean the way the law specifies it needs to be done, we are going to lose a lot of people who should not be lost and retain a lot of people that we might actually need to let go of. Do we want that? Does any party want that? Only you can fix that. Only Congress can fix that. The agencies can only do so much within the current rules. So that's a little bit on our first pillar, and I'm sorry I'm getting too in depth. Our second pillar is reducing procedural bloat. That 7,119 pages or the 100 copies of War and Peace, we've got to get them down. We have tools to do that today. This is my favorite person to talk about regulatory bloat being reduced with AI tools, and we're working with the Stanford Reg Lab on this. You can talk to Ben or one of the other members of the Stanford of the Scouting team about this as well. But we've got to start working on that. The third was the digital infrastructure that Andrew touched on, I think, in a number of different areas. And then the fourth one is just the major point we're trying to leave you all with, which is we must move to a new operating model that is fit for the digital age, in which we close the feedback loop. And that is a new model in which policy and implementation aren't miles apart, but brought together in ways that we're actually learning as we go and acting on that learning. Big lift, I get it. It's a huge lift. It's not like any of us is like, here is exactly what to do. We have to co-create that. I'm gonna say we all have to co-create that, and we're gonna have to test and learn our way to that new model. But that is our big fourth recommendation, which is sort of the grandfather of all of them.
Amazing. You've already kind of gotten to where I was trying to get us, which is current day and interesting dynamics that have happened since December of 2024 in lots of ways 10 years ago. But in lots of ways, some of the policy cruft you were talking about has been bulldozed through, and I think, in lots of ways, things are moving a lot faster in the executive branch than they previously did. Some of those will be subject to court challenges, which is what all those people being so very careful were trying to avoid. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, what stands that maybe people were being overly cautious about in the past that is now allowed, where there are certain hurdles that come back. But then we're also dealing with the new world that happened to us in last summer with the overturning of the Chevron doctrine in the Supreme Court, Loper Bright saying it is the job of the courts to figure out what Congress said. We are not going to defer to the agency's interpretation. So it's going to be really interesting for these cases that are now making their way over to the courts that are going to be interpreted with less deference to agencies and more trying to divine what Congress actually meant. So it's a really interesting dynamic. We'll all be watching it, but then the question becomes, okay, so how does Congress operate in this new world? And what exactly, because just to be really clear, I think we're coming for, potentially a backlash and extra caution on the Congress side of, like, the Supreme Court says we need to be clear, so I'm going to go in exactly every field that should be on this website in statutory language. Please don't do that.
Please don't do that.
So, Congress is dealing with a lot of contradictory information, and the question of, do we need to be really, really specific to get the executive to follow what we're going to say, or to make sure the courts don't overturn our intent, or that we're really clear with it? At the same time, that we do have a trifecta. So when you talk about feedback loops, I will say one of the positives of a trifecta is that you should have better relationships between the executive and legislative branch to talk about the kinds of things that need to be addressed in statute. So lots of dynamics. And my question to you guys to wrap, and then we'll have time for one, maybe two questions, is how do you see all of these recommendations in the context of the crazy dynamics of today?
What a finish. I'll make a start, seeing as I'm the guest. I mean, I think regardless of, how you interpret the approach of the executive and the actions that it's taken since inauguration, to me, it feels like it's of a piece with a fairly global trend around some of this, which is a sense from the public, certainly feel it at home, I can see it in Canada, I can see it in lots of places where public digital works. People are not seeing government as responsive. And there has been an electoral reaction to that. Now, how the executive responds to that democratic signal will vary a lot. And the UK Prime Minister said, I think just yesterday, we're going to be making 15% cuts to our civil service, but we're also going to espouse some radically different ways of working, and we're going to invest in those. So there's a sort of two sides of the coin element to this. But I think the thing to for everybody, and not just in this country, but I think in almost pretty much every kind of democracy at the moment, needs to recognise that a lot of voters aren't feeling the government is listening to them or is capable of listening and acting in response to them, whether that's in response to their needs, whether that's response to a crisis, whether that's response to opportunity. And as a group of people who are interested in the health of the state and the capacity of state to translate political intent of all kinds of different shapes and sizes into public reality, I think that's why these ideas are so important. Like this is something that we will all sink and swim on effectively. And certainly the Labour government in the UK, I think, is acutely conscious that it's not going to fight the next election in 2029 against the opposition that it would tend to. It's going to fight it against an insurgent party that basically thinks, yeah, these people are all the same. I just don't buy it. They're not doing anything for me. I don't see the difference. So why would I invest in that? So it's a fundamental question for institutions to look at this stuff and address it. And I think that will play out in different ways in different countries, and it'll play out differently here to how it does in the UK. But fundamentally, I think that's the route.
Yeah, I think that's. I think much the same here. I have a friend who works is a senior leader at an agency who is dealing with all of the chaos that you are hearing about. And it's very difficult right now. Somebody was talking to me about the impact of the rifts that are coming, for instance, and hey, if there was a time for Congress to take up civil service reform, it would be now. But even in all that, he said to me the other day, 90% of my brain is dealing with this incredible chaos, and 10% is going, we're missing the bigger story. Like, we're so distracted by this that the impact of AI on our agency this year and next year is getting so little attention, and yet that is the thing that is happening, not just here, but in the wider world. And I think that I think he's right. I think it's even broader than that, right? Like, before Inauguration Day, we had these massive forces of change about to hit us or hitting us. They are still hitting us. Chevron, AI, we're potential fiscal austerity. We have an opportunity. We can sort of let that happen and react on a daily basis to the news cycle, or we can say we have to shape the future, and we know that it cannot look like today regardless, right? It needed to change anyway. And I do want to get into that space and say, what is it going to look like, and how do we all have a hand in that? I do think that your idea, for instance, of like there'll be a backlash against sort of what is seen as executive, an aggressive approach, shall we say, from the executive branch, and we'll try to be more constraining and more specific. We're going to get worse outcomes that way. There is a way to pull back from that and be more thoughtful and say, even in this new environment, when an agency is performing poorly, does it help to add mandates and constraints when they are already hugely constrained, right? I mean, now even more so. Or do we need to be able to think in a mode of enablement and capacity building as much as we think in mandates and constraints? You mentioned that there's been some bulldozing through a bunch of policy craft. Yes, but not a thoughtful unwinding of that. That work still needs to happen. I was hopeful that the Doge folks would be more, okay, we come in, we find this legal barrier, we go to Congress and work with staffers there to unwind that. But instead, they're just sort of walking over it. So the work to say, oh, maybe that, could be reduced still needs to happen. So I think that my big message in this moment is to pull back from the day-to-day and think about the profound changes that we are going to be part of, and really lean into shaping those with a longer term vision of what the relationship between the executive and legislative branches needs to be in this day and age.
Okay, that was so good. We're gonna punt the questions to the reception where everybody can come up and ask individually. But let me just say, my takeaways for you are read the paper, the How We Know. Follow Polkadot on Twitter and Blue Sky, and subscribe to the Eating Policy Substack. Follow us at PopVox Foundation on all the channels, and sign up for Future Proofing newsletter edited by Aubrey Wilson at popvox.org/futureproofing. Caseworkers out there, we appreciate you so much. Please check out our caseworker resources at popvox.org/casework. And we've got an event coming up next week on technology for April 28th with information in the back, so please check that out. Thank you.